Hey Bullets YouTube channel.
Hurry up, now tell us why you're here.
Mark Burnsley and Kajima Mikino have both been
fired, and Bill Gears,
this is his look, has retired from Piston Cup racing during the off-season. Same with Cal Williams. Dale Earnhardt Jr. retired from Piston Cup racing after the first practice session for this race. I guess Alex Bloman has a full-time ride now. And here we have the racer list, which looks completely new compared to last season. Almost no racers from last season remain. Look at all the rookies! And even racers who do remain, they're basically all next gens! Wow, the next generation racers have really taken over. Look at all these new rookies! And even new looks, like with Ryan Newcar. And now we've got more racers, including another Charger. Look at all the new rookies! Brent Rims, Rich Mixon, all new racers. Charles Tyrestrong is a backup racer. Kurt Busch Tire's a new look too. And there's even another Thunderbolt! And we've got even more rookies. That is a lot of rookies. But the next generation racer takeover has happened.
and there's another Draft Rev.
Will Draft Rev Jr. James Garrison is back, and here are even more rookies and racers with new looks. Wow. But we do have one stock car, and that is, of course,
Lightning McQueen, Ka-chow. And compared with last season, there are way fewer racers, only just over 100. Now, Pitbull Speed Racer, Billy Carjoy, James Garrison, Ryan Newcar, who went airborne, and Kurt Busch Tire are out this race because of Go Logano. Why? And also, none of them are Axlers. And Piston Cup fans would boo Go Logano for what he did. Now onto the starting grid, where Jackson Storm will obviously start at pole position with Danny Suarez, who's outside. Row 2 has Aaron Clocker and H.J. Hollis, who's outside. I wonder how they'll do this race. Now onto row 3, where Nick Shift will be starting alongside Herb Kerbler, who is outside. Now onto row 4, where J.D. McPellar and Flip Dover will be starting. Both did well during practice. Row 5 has Chase Racelot and Paul Conrev, making his very first Piston Cup start. Row 6 has Barry DePedal with Michael Roeder, also making his very first start, who's outside. Row 7 has two racers making their very first start, George Newman and Conrad Camber. Row 8 has Spiky Phillips making his very first Piston Cup start, with Dan Garcia, who's outside. Row 9 has Richie Gunzit and Jim Reverick, both of whom raced in the last race, the LA 500. Row 10 has Bubba Wheelhouse and Ed Trunken, both of whom also raced in the 2016 season. Row 11 has Denny Carlin, who is back to the Piston Cup as a next-generation racer, with Kevin Carvick, who's outside. Row 12 has Brad Karslowski also making the upgrade, and Karsten Ace Dillon making his very first Piston Cup start. Now onto row 13, where Gogo Logano made a bad first impression, and Kyle Carson, who's outside. Row 14 has Rowdy Revan Bush, who is sponsored by Hostile Takeover Bank, the first time that this sponsor has been to the Piston Cup since Chick Hicks last made a start. Martin Carts Jr. will start, who's outside. Now onto row 15, where Eric Breaker will be starting alongside Chris Roman. Now onto row 16, where Cam Spinner will be starting alongside Noah Gosek, making his very first Piston Cup start. Row 17 has Sheldon Shifter making his very first Piston Cup start. And also, the first time that Team Sputterstop started a racer not named Moray Clutchburn since 1984. And who's outside is Harvey Rodcap. Row 18 has Steve Slick LePage, who was not very slick during practice or qualifying, and Ryan Inside Laney, who will be starting on the outside. Row 19 has JP Drive and Tim Treadless. What are you two doing all the way, almost at the back of the pack? I thought you two were better than this. Row 20 has Rich Mixon, who I can't be disappointed in because this is his very first race, and Jonas Carvers will be starting to his outside. In row 21, we have two more rookies, M. Fast Fong and Will Rush. And starting in 43rd is Lightning McQueen. Qualifying using his past champions provisional and is also the only stock car in the race. And all of these cars, among many others, failed to qualify for this race. And also, this is the first time that Team Dynaco will not have a team in a Piston Cup race since 1969! That was almost 50 years ago! Jeff Gorvette is giving an interview with RSN about the next generation racers. And then he says this when he sees Lightning McQueen. This is not the only news with Lightning McQueen because the Hudson Hornets legendary crew chief, Smokey, is also back to the Piston Cup after a 63-year absence. And he is Lightning McQueen's new crew chief. What a time to return to the Piston Cup. I hope he does okay though, because, after all, it has been 63 years since he was last the crew chief in the Piston Cup. And he says this to Lightning McQueen before the race starts. And Daryl Cartrip, of course, says, "Boogity, boogity, boogity, let's go racing!" As he usually says at the start of every race. As usual, Jackson Storm will start the race and lead until lap 18, where Rich Mixon would take the lead from him, leading off of pit cycles. But after the pit stops are done, Jackson Storm would retake the lead, leading until lap 30. Meanwhile, on lap 21, Rowdy Revan Bush and Brad Karslowski would wreck each other out. And Kevin Carvick would be out on lap 27 because he hit the wall really hard. Lightning McQueen is also making his way up the field. And Bob Cutlass says Lightning McQueen is making steady progress in the early parts of this race. And then Natalie Certain would reply, but it won't be enough to catch Storm. And Daryl Cartrip would say, considering that he started dead last, I don't think he's doing half bad out there. And Smokey tells Lightning McQueen that he can finish in the top 10. But Lightning McQueen is aiming for a win against 42 next generation racers. And Danny Swerves would take the lead on lap 30. Briefly, before Jackson Storm would retake the lead on lap 31 and lead until lap 491, leading for 460 laps? How does any car lead for 460 laps in a row? Especially when the race has 500 laps! How, Jackson Storm? Leading that many laps in a row doesn't help you. Leave some laps for the rest of us. Meanwhile, Karsten Ace Dillon would be out on lap 39 because of engine failure, and Denny Carlin would be out on lap 40 because of bad handling. And here is what he had to say. Well, I guess it does need some getting used to. And then, on lap 53, Gogo Logano would get Cam Spinner loose. And then Smokey would say, wreck in turn 2, wreck in turn 2. Oh no, Cam Spinner got loose. And then Daryl Cartrip says, trouble in turn 2. The big one happens behind them. And Cam Spinner is involved in the crash. Same with George Newman, Tim Treadless, and Gogo Logano. And then Bob Cutlass would say this, describing the crash. And then, oh no, Steve Slick LePage is involved in the crash now. And then Jim Reverick would almost hit Lightning McQueen. And then Daryl Cartrip would say, Cam Spinner is up in the air, and Harvey hits him. As Daryl Cartrip just said, Cam Spinner went airborne, and then Noah Gosek almost got hit by Cam Spinner. But unfortunately, Harvey Rodcap is involved in the crash. Same with JP Drive and Rich Mixon. But what's even worse is that Martin Carrix Jr. and Kyle Carson are now out because of the crash. And Bob Cutlass would say that the crash is over. And afterwards, JP Drive, Steve Slick LePage, Gogo Logano, George Newman, Tim Treadless, and Cam Spinner are all Ouch! And Daryl Cartrip announces that pit road is open and the green light is on. Lightning McQueen goes in just like everyone else, and he just parks there on lap 55. And here is what Daryl Cartrip had to say about that. And then Lightning McQueen is talking to his team. And lap 56 is about to start, but Team Rusty's is not on the track. Lightning McQueen makes the decision to retire from the race on lap 55 and be replaced by what is now an unknown racer. And Bob Cutlass comments on this fact. And Daryl Cartrip doesn't believe what he is seeing. But someone who does believe what he's seeing is Ray Reverham, Jackson Storm's crew chief. And then Jackson Storm says this back to his crew chief. Jackson Storm is referring to this car, which he calls Costume Girl. And Bob Cutlass says that the green flag is out. And of course, Jackson Storm continues to lead. How? And the unknown racer is struggling to keep up on lap 57. On lap 58, J.D. McPillar would go down a lap. And then Lightning McQueen would become the unknown racer's crew chief right before lap 58. And Bob Cutlass is learning who this new unknown racer is. Same with Daryl Cartrip, saying that it's her very first race. Natalie Certain disagrees with this and says that she actually has one win. Lightning McQueen is now coaching this previously unknown racer, Cruz Ramirez, who has this look. And of course, Jackson Storm keeps leading all of the laps. And for a time period of 340 laps, over half of the race, there were literally no notable events other than Cruz Ramirez making her way through the pack. This is the 4 to 500. How could over half of the race have no notable events? Finally, on lap 414, something notable happened. And it was Cruz Ramirez missing her pit stall, needing to back up one spot to get to her pit stall. And also, J.D. McPillar is back on the lead lap on lap 415. And then on lap 424, Conrad Camber would push Nick Shift. And on lap 491, finally, someone took the lead from Jackson Storm. Thank you, Danny Suarez, for taking the lead 2 different times this race. Oh, wait. Danny Suarez only took the lead because Jackson Storm backed up. Why? At least you gave up the lead. But what he does next is that he bullies Cruz Ramirez. Why, Jackson Storm? Why are you being a bully? Why? Lightning McQueen would console and then encourage Cruz Ramirez after the bullying. And then Jackson Storm would retake the lead on lap 493 and lead until the last lap. That also meant that Jackson Storm would be in the lead for at least 1 yard for every single lap of this race. How? Now, on to lap 499, where we're going to go into the commentary. Jackson Storm then asks his crew chief, how far back is she now? And then Ray Reverham would say, look behind you. Jackson Storm says, what? And then Cruz Ramirez would say, good evening, Storm. And then Jackson Storm would reply, wait, how did you... ... And Cruz Ramirez then says, just drafted on your butt, nothing to be concerned about. And then Lightning McQueen would say, like 2 June bugs on a summer night, referring back to the 1950s. And then Cruz Ramirez would say this, calling her virtual assistant Hamilton. And then she tells him to call out their speed. And then Hamilton would call out the speed. And then Jackson Storm would say this. And then Lightning McQueen says last lap. And then Smokey, where's the picture? Smokey then says, "Come on, Cruz." Now, onto the final lap of the 2017 Florida 500. Still on the commentary, and then Cruz Ramirez would say, "Uh-oh, my GPS is saying I have slow traffic in my way." And then Jackson Storm would say, "No, you're not winning this." And then Cruz Ramirez would say, "You're angry." And then Jackson Storm would say, "I am not angry." And then Cruz Ramirez says that you can use that anger to push through. And Jackson Storm says, "I said I'm not angry." And then Cruz Ramirez would attempt to pass Jackson Storm for the lead. And then Jackson Storm says, "I don't think so, no!" And then shoves Cruz Ramirez into the wall. Lightning McQueen says, "Cruz, get out of there." And then Jackson Storm would say, "You don't belong on this track." And then Cruz Ramirez would say, "Yes, I do." And then Cruz Ramirez would flip over Jackson Storm, using the wall to gain momentum to do the flip. This flip is very similar to the one the Hudson Hornet did over Leroy Hemming in 1954. How did Cruz Ramirez do this in her very first race? And after the flip, Cruz Ramirez would take the lead and then go on to win the 2017 Florida 500, winning her very first race in a race she didn't even start. What an achievement by Cruz Ramirez. And Bob Cutlass would say, "I don't believe it, it's Cruz Ramirez for the win." And Daryl Cartrip is speechless. And Cruz Ramirez would be congratulated on her win by both her team and by fans. Oh, and don't forget, Cruz Ramirez ended a 20-race winning streak by Jackson Storm. Hooray for Cruz Ramirez! And don't forget, the last time I made a Piston Cup race video where Jackson Storm didn't win was over a year ago. To the commentary, where Daryl Cartrip says, "Man, heck of a win." And then Natalie Certain would say, "Yeah, heck of a win." And then on to the post-race commentary, where on the track, Danny Suarez would say, "Hey Cruz, you were flying." And then Cruz would say, well, she says thanks. And then Chase Racelot would say, "Girl had it rolling today." And then afterwards, Ryan Inside Lady would say, "That was cool." I mean, it was pretty cool. And then Cruz Ramirez would say, "Thank you." And we've got one more quote here, and that is from Bubba Wheelhouse, who says to Cruz that her blinker's on. And then she says, "It is? Oh, you got me. Very funny." And then Lightning McQueen would say this, encouraging Cruz Ramirez to do this, a donut, after she won this race. And Lightning McQueen says that she will get used to it. Well, the smoke. And then Sterling, the owner of Rusty's, wants Cruz Ramirez to replace Lightning McQueen. And Cruz Ramirez rejects the offer. And Tex Dynaco would say, "Well then, race for me," wanting Cruz Ramirez to race for Dynaco. And then Tex Dynaco would say this to Cruz Ramirez afterwards. And then Tex Dynaco says, "As you know, we have a long history of great racers, except for Cal." "Tex, I'm not gonna forget when you wanted Nick Charger for your team." And then Cal Weather says, "Guys, I'm still right here." And then Lightning McQueen would encourage Cruz Ramirez to join Team Dynaco. But Sterling doesn't care. And then Sterling then assumes that Lightning McQueen is now retired and needs him for a photo shoot first thing Monday morning. But Lightning McQueen also wins the 2017 Florida 500 because the car that starts the race is also credited with the win. This is the first time that a racer substitution in a Piston Cup race resulted in a win. Jackson Storm will finish second for the very first time in his career, finishing second this race in his 21st race as a Piston Cup racer. Jackson Storm, racing isn't always about winning, and take this second place finish. Danny Suarez will finish third this race, followed by H.J. Hollis in fourth, Aaron Clocker in fifth, Nick Shift sixth, Herb Kerbler seventh, J.D. McPillar eighth, Flipped Over ninth, and Chase Racelot rounding out the top 10. Will Rush will be the last car to finish on the lead lap this race, finishing 30th in his first race. Cruz Ramirez won a race without even starting it. And I already mentioned the rest of the top 10, including Danny Suarez and Chase Racelot. Paul Conrad is the best performing racer, making his debut, aside from Cruz Ramirez, finishing 11th this race, followed by Michael Roeder, Barry DePedal, Conrad Camber, and Spiky Phillips to round out the top 15. Dan Garcia, Jim Reverick, Richie Gunzit, Ryan Inside Laney, and Bubba Wheelhouse will round out the top 20, with Ed Trunken earning 100 points from this race by finishing 21st, ahead of Eric Breaker, Chris Roman, Noah Gosek, and Harvey Rodcap rounding out the top 25. Sheldon Shifter finishes 26th in his first ever race. Jonas Carvers will finish 27th. Rich Mixon and M. Fast Fong both finish on the lead lap, as well as Will Rush in their very first Piston Cup race. Every race has its winners and losers, and JP Drive was definitely a loser, finishing 31st. Steve Slick LePage, Gogo Logano, George Newman, Tim Treadless, and Cam Spinner were all out due to that lap 55 crash. Martin Carrick Jr. and Kyle Carson were out before that, and everyone else was out even before that. No point standings because I just showed you the point standings. After the burnout, Cruz Ramirez was swarmed by many different cars wanting to ask her questions, and then Lightning McQueen would say this: "Kid's got a lot of stuff. Hey, Doc." Sort of referring back to what the late Hudson Hornet said this about Lightning McQueen back in 2005.
Remember to press the notifications button, which goes ring, ring, ring after you press it. And lightning strikes back, and that's as if you subscribed, of course. And thank you for watching this entire video.
Now that will be a race to remember. The next videos on this channel will be remembering Dale Earnhardt. Dale Earnhardt needs no introduction. You'll better know why I made the video when it comes out. And also, I'll also be making the video that covers the second race of the 2017 Piston Cup season. Once again, like 2016, I'll be making the videos for all 36 races of the season. The next videos will all be coming out soon enough.
It's been 4 years and 5 different calendar years, but unfortunately, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine is still going on. The Ukrainian people just want to live in peace and have freedom, but this common dream was ruined by the tyrant and bully, Vladimir Putin. Not only is this war a terrible thing, why would Putin see the need to keep the war going, considering how many losses that he's taking? Over 1 million people have lost their lives in this almost 4-year-long war. And don't forget that this conflict as a whole began almost 12 years ago. We here at the K-Bullets Piston Cup YouTube channel stand with Ukraine in their struggle against Vladimir Putin's tyranny and recognize Ukraine's true borders as shown by this map. Despite what Putin and his cronies say, Crimea, the Donbass, and all of the Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts are Ukrainian territory, which this map shows. Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, Nechai Shvetsya Darutsya, Ukraini Permoha. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. May Ukraine be granted victory very soon.